Hey everyone, I hope that you all are doing well and that everything's going okay as you move into week 8 of this semester. I know everybody has a lot of responsibilities, and I feel like I reiterate this every week, but I do hope that you all are getting the rest that you need. So this week we are delving into some discussion around settler colonialism on Indigenous Peoples Day today as I'm recording this. We're thinking about, through Evelyn Nakano Glenn's piece, how we can understand settler colonialism as an ongoing structure that impacts social relations and our political economic framework, as opposed to thinking about settler colonialism simply as a past historical event. So, when we think about settler colonialism as an ongoing structure, we're thinking about engaging it as a framework for understanding the specificities of racisms and sexisms affecting different racialized groups, while also highlighting structural and cultural factors that undergird and link these racisms and sexisms. So, as Evelyn Nakano Glenn points out, the aim with this way of thinking, this way of taking up settler colonialism as a framework, is to avoid lumping different racisms together and constructing some kind of unintended monolith. And avoiding seeing racisms and sexisms as completely separate and unrelated. So, making space for both identifying patterns across different experiences of racism and sexism, while avoiding, monolithic expressions, different monolithic frameworks to express various racisms. So, with seeing settler colonialism as, this ongoing structure, Evelyn Nakano Glenn is thinking about how the logic, tenets, and identities engendered by settler colonialism continue to exist and shape race, gender, class, and sexual formations in the present. So, Evelyn Nakano Glenn highlights how decolonization in this conversation is a necessary goal. So, looking toward decolonization and thinking about how, in looking towards decolonization, it's so key to parse out, distinguishing liberal inclusion programs from liberation projects. So, this is thinking about going beyond narratives and logics that really stem from settler colonialism, that are focused on property, that are focused on individuality, and thinking about, linking success essentially to capital accumulation and extractive, exploitative capital relations, as well as empty politics of representation. So, thinking about how we could identify liberal projects of inclusion that are distinct from liberation as simply, focusing on a politics of representation where, for instance, diversity and inclusion programs where the presence of diversity is intended to suffice, and thinking about how practices and different changes that would really energize and live out, different principles of diversity, are pushed to the side in favor of just, the veneer, the superficiality of having the presence of diversity. So rather, decolonization is thinking more towards, opting for, as the author puts it, counter-hegemonic narratives. So thinking about narratives of resistance that enable imagining liberation outside of colonial structures and colonial logics. So, as we move into this conversation, I do also just want to give a brief content warning that there will be discussions of violence, discussions of genocide, in order to, articulate the historicization of settler colonialism, as well as, its ongoing impacts. So, the author does, in order to start thinking about the ways that settler colonialism continues to impact us, and it continues to, manifest as an ongoing structure in terms of social relations and political economic frameworks, first thinks about how the history of it took shape. So, thinking about the ways that she highlights how the British colonization of North America was distinct from Spanish and French colonization projects, and that we saw how it was very family based. So, in other words, instead of different hordes of male colonists coming in and, essentially engaging in these projects of colonization on their own, there were entire families that were engaged in these different projects of warfare that, were engaged in, being privy to the dynamics of colonization and associated forms of genocide and violence that were happening. So, from examples like the massacre at Wounded Knee to the Trail of Tears, there are a variety of examples that highlight how that genocide took shape, how those forms of violence took shape. So we also saw how, the role that schooling played in attempting to enact this form of social death on Native children. So boarding schools, which have now been more so in, the social consciousness, the cultural imagination, as, we've found out about, different deaths that happened at different boarding schools. These boarding schools were used as a tool for Native children to unlearn Native ways of being and seeing, and they involved mandatory family separation, so kids were not allowed to, often maintain contact with their families. They were taught different colonial gender norms, such as the division of labor that colonial teachers viewed as appropriate. So they asked children to unlearn notions of women being able to engage in different forms of physical labor, for instance, and ask them to adhere to different forms of English or British propriety in various ways. So thinking about the different forms of abuse that took shape, the different murders that did happen at these schools, and thinking about that being, a history of settler colonialism that is important to, keep in mind in this conversation. So, thinking about as we moved into the mid 20th century, we saw different legislative acts, such as the 1953 Congress Act to terminate tribal status, where it attempted to, further divorce Native communities from their cultural and social identities. So, it did this work of, on top of, removing their land, forcing them into low-paying jobs, and asking them to essentially give up, their various the various elements of identity associated with tribal status and whatnot. So it is interesting to think about, in the reading, the ways that Evelyn Nakano Glenn highlights how, with the different ways that tribal status was removed from different folks, the different ways that the boarding schools function to ask children to unlearn various aspects of Native ways of being and seeing. Simultaneously, we saw the historicization of frontiersmen appropriating different elements of Native cultures. So, people wearing moccasins, people, shouting war cries. We also saw this in, film and TV in, a profound way. The different ways that Native identity was stereotyped. The different ways that, from American frontiersmen to, the mid 20th century, the different ways that Native identity was distorted and, narrowed through different forms of stereotyping. So yeah, thinking about that in relation to this conversation about how settler colonialism has functioned. So think in connection between different legal statutes, legal changes such as the changes to tribal status, just generally thinking about culturally how these different images, how these different forms of appropriation did impact the social imagination around different Native cultures and whatnot. So in this discussion, it's also important to think about how settler colonialism was really central to the formation of US whiteness and national identity. So it helped cultivate understandings of the American dream in the sense that it required a disavowal of settlers' violence and genocide in order to give rise to those notions of the American dream. So, you know, the role of settler colonialism in disavowing violence and genocide worked to construct this narrative of pioneers coming here, and it was difficult travel, and they began a new life from scratch, and those that this land belonged to just simply disappeared. And it really tied into the construction of understandings around civilization and non-civilization, and that was central to this racialized project around, how we understood the formation of U.S. national identity. So, thinking about how this ties into the American dream, this notion of anybody can, create something from grit and determination, while, disavowing the different forms of, violence, the different forms of systemic obstacles that prevent or thwart, the capacity to have those experiences, to be able to have this notion of the mythical American dream. So the author also points out how key it is to understand the erasure of conditions that made the establishment of American capitalism possible. So, from stealing native land in order to, have that land to, essentially provide the foundation for the cultivation of wealth and crops and whatnot that American capitalism was founded upon. It also engages in this erasure of the labor of African Americans that provided the labor and the formation of wealth that white folks profited off of with the establishment of racial capitalism in our country. So, thinking about the ways that Evelyn Nakano Glenn connects the conversation to Mexican and Chinese Americans as well. So, thinking about with settler colonial expansion into the Southwest, we saw the dispossession of Mexican landowners through theft, boundary manipulation, and other measures. So, a really key aspect of this was creating new forms of privatization. So, once again, thinking about the ways that private property has, and property ownership has played a key role in establishing these different forms of racialized hierarchies. So, thinking about with Mexican landowners becoming dispossessed of their land through these, dynamics of colonial extraction, different communal grazing lands were privatized, and it shifted capacities for self-sufficiency and contributed to the destabilization of the Mexican economy. So then we saw, a reliance on different American work, which emerged from these very clear decisions to take different forms of land and whatnot. So this contributed to the disruption of families, with men traveling for work when there was not other opportunities for work possible. And we also saw this was similar with Chinese American families, as Evelyn Nakano points out. So thinking about with the Chinese Exclusion Act, so the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that she points to as well. We saw, with both Chinese Americans as well as Mexican Americans, these dynamics of containment, erasure, terrorism, and removal at play, that and how these different forces and different ways of enacting social control, work to reinforce different and establish different racialized hierarchies. So the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act prevented immigration, for instance, and the establishment of citizenship as well. So, we saw both all of these different measures around controlling immigration after the destabilization of economies take shape with, the establishment of a contemporary, American capitalism in various ways. So, it's interesting to think about the ways that Evelyn Nakano Glenn draws this thread between, how the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that prevented immigration and the establishment of citizenship was then shifted with World War II in response to China's identification as a U.S. ally. So it's key to think about the connection between settler colonialism and its associated practices of exclusion and violence, how that can be contingent on ongoing military priorities that, fuel contemporary forms of imperialism. So we do see today with in understanding settler colonialism as an ongoing structure, that impacts social relations and political economic frameworks, how you know, we could see a parallel between the construction of ideas around, creating a binary between civilized and uncivilized with, historical forms of settler colonialism, as well as the ways that the justification of imperialism takes shape through a rationale of spreading democracy. So, thinking about how the expansion of democracy is often a guise for extracting resources and fueling ongoing forms of settler colonialism. So, yeah, so thinking about the ways that those different logics, those different rationales continue to impact the ways that different U.S. military forces function, how just generally thinking about the ways that those logics impact the continuation of different forms of white supremacy, and with that, thinking about how the project of decolonization is so intertwined with, unearthing the ways that racial capitalism shapes social relations by demanding exploitation and hierarchy, and imagining a world untethered to the logics of capital accumulation. So with that ending ongoing US military imperialism, freeing understandings of identity and culture from colonization, and generally the demand to unearth and dismantle different forms of white supremacy in its various forms, from its logics to its practices, and all of the ways that it does contribute to this reinforcement of settler colonialism as an ongoing structure. So I am really interested to hear your thoughts on this particular piece. This is the only piece we're reading for this particular week, and I am interested to just hear what your takeaways are, as well as your general thoughts on decolonization. But yeah, look forward to talking with you all. Have a great week.